Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening a file that I think, if we are being totally honest with ourselves, sits at the very back of almost everyone's mind. It's really the ultimate cold case.
Right, because it is the only case where the witnesses are technically, well, they're gone, or at least they were gone for a little bit.
Exactly. We are talking about the moment the screen goes black, the big exit. But before you roll your eyes and think we're about to get into some sort of theological debate or a campfire ghost story session, I want to frame this differently for you. Mm-hmm. We aren't looking at this like priests, and we certainly aren't looking at it like mystics. We're looking at this like data analysts.
Pattern recognition. I mean, that is the entire mission today.
Right. Because we have a stack of sources here that are, quite frankly, just baffling if you try to view them in isolation. Yep. We have accounts from people who clinically died. No pulse, no breath, brain activity, fat lining. And then they came back. But the real hook for me isn't just that they came back. It is who these people are.
It is a wildly eclectic control group. If you were running a strict scientific study, this is exactly the kind of diverse sample size you would want to eliminate any kind of cultural bias.
It's a complete mess of demographics. We have a militant atheist who is dealing drugs. We have a conservative Southern Baptist pastor. We have a 19-year-old Air Force cadet. We have a geology scientist who didn't believe in anything she couldn't measure with a caliper.
And an ice climber?
And an ice climber, yes. And yet when you lay their testimonies side by side, which is exactly what we have done for this deep dive, the overlap is undeniable. It just forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question.
Which is if these people are running totally different operating systems, mentally speaking. Some are religious, some are aggressively anti-religious, some just young and indifferent. Why is the architecture of what they saw so remarkably consistent?
Yeah, why does it match?
It strongly suggests that the experience is not just a projection of their culture. It suggests they are visiting a shared territory. Think of it like this. If 5 people from 5 different continents go to Paris, they are all going to describe the Eiffel Tower. They might describe it differently based on their vocabulary, but the underlying structure is exactly the same. That is what we are seeing in this data.
So that is the roadmap for you today. We are going to strip away the specific religious language they might use after the fact to try and explain it to their friends. And we're going to look strictly at the structural engineering of the afterlife. So who are our guides today? Walk us through the cast.
Well, we have 7 primary sources for this analysis. And I want to start with Nancy Ryan. She is really fascinating because she acts as our hostile witness, so to speak. She is a scientist, a geologist, completely trained to be skeptical. She was a confirmed atheist who died during surgery following a really horrific bike accident.
It is the one who was dragged by the SUV, right?
Correct. Brutal physical trauma. She had absolutely no framework for spiritual experiences whatsoever. Then we have Brian Melvin. His story is intense. He describes himself as a militant atheist and a drug dealer living in Tucson. He ended up contracting cholera from drinking contaminated water at a construction site.
Darwin soup, I think he called it.
That's the exact phrase he used. He basically dissolved from the inside out. Very painful. Then we have Howard Pittman, who is on the total opposite end of the spectrum. He was a bivocational pastor and a police officer, upstanding citizen, very religious, very disciplined. He suffered a ruptured artery, an aneurysm that just bled him out.
So we have the skeptic, the criminal, and the preacher.
And the adventurer, that would be Peter Panagore. He was ice climbing in Banff over in Canada and succumbed to hypothermia. He literally froze to death on the side of a mountain.
Which we should probably note is often described medically as a peaceful way to go, but his description of the actual transition is anything but passive.
Very true. Then we have Steve Kang. He is an atheist art professor who died in a French hospital from a duodenum rupture. Again, a very medical, very painful physical exit. And finally, we have 2 younger voices. Nicole Kerr, who was a 19-year-old cadet at the Air Force Academy involved in a catastrophic car wreck. And Holden Lee, a teenager who also died in a fatal car accident.
So broadly speaking, we have every single base covered here. Young, old, religious, atheist, criminal, saint.
And our goal is to find the common ground. What happens to all of them regardless of what they believed before the lights went out?
Let's just unpack this right at the beginning, the exit, because in movies, death is always a fade to black, maybe a little tear rolling down the cheek and a slow monitored beep. But in these accounts, the separation of the self from the body is violent, and then it's just instant clarity.
That is the first major data point we need to look at. In almost every single one of these cases, the physical death is absolute agony. Nancy is literally crushed. Peter is freezing to death with his body shutting down. Brian Melvin is in excruciating pain from severe dehydration and organ failure. But the moment the connection is severed, snap.
It is instantaneous.
The pain doesn't just slowly fade away, it vanishes completely. And they do not feel dead. They actually report feeling more alive than they ever did inside the physical body. Nicole Kerr's account is incredibly specific on this detail. She is in a Corvette spinning out about to hit a boulder. She ejects from the vehicle, and she explicitly states she felt zero pain upon impact.
Because she wasn't in the vehicle anymore.
Exactly. She says her soul, her consciousness, flew out of the vehicle before the physical body even hit the ground. It is almost like an automatic eject seat mechanism for the consciousness. The body takes the massive physical hit, but the operator is already clear of the wreckage.
That aligns perfectly with what Brian Melvin experienced. He is lying in bed dying of cholera. He describes the room smelling of sickness. He is in intense pain. Everything feels so heavy. And then he watches a hand, his own spirit hand, come right out of his physical hand.
And it passes right through his dog's chin.
That specific image just stuck with me. The ghost hand passing through the solid physical dog. It is such a strange, specific detail that you wouldn't just make up if you were trying to sound holy or mystical.
And instantly, his sensory input completely changes. Remember, Brian was nearsighted in life. He wore thick glasses. Suddenly, he is out of his body, and he can see the microscopic texture of the ceiling paint. He can hear frequencies in the room he couldn't hear before.
Peter Panagore describes it in a very similar way. He felt his physical body collapse on the ice, but his consciousness didn't go to sleep or fade out. It expanded. He says he became this giant orb of awareness.
Which brings us to a crucial concept in near-death experience research. This is really what separates these stories from standard brain hallucinations. It is a term called veridical perception.
Okay, for the listener who hasn't heard that medical term before, break it down for us. What does that mean?
Veridical essentially means truthful or verifiable. In the context of NDEs, it refers to when the clinically dead person sees or hears something in the physical world that they should not possibly be able to perceive, something that is later independently verified to be absolutely true.
Because if it were just a hallucination caused by a dying, oxygen-starved brain, you shouldn't be able to see what's happening out in the hallway or on the roof of the building.
Precisely. A hallucination happens entirely inside the head. Veridical perception implies your consciousness is operating outside the head. Brian Melvin is the textbook example of this phenomenon. He floats up through the ceiling of his bedroom, he is hovering above his house in Tucson, and he looks down and sees the swamp cooler on the roof.
Now we have to point out he's never been on that roof before.
Never. But he sees a baling wire and a red bandana tied around the access ports of the cooler, just completely random debris.
Very random.
But later on, after he is miraculously resuscitated and recovers from the cholera, he eventually climbs up to the roof to do some home maintenance. And there they are, the exact baling wire and the red bandana, just like he saw when he was dead.
That gives me chills, honestly. How do you explain that biologically? If his eyes were closed shut in a bed, how did his dying brain just happen to guess there was a bandana tied to a pipe on the roof?
You really cannot explain it biologically. That is the massive problem materialists have with these specific accounts. Steve Kang had a similar reality check moment, but his was almost comedic in how he reacted to it.
Oh, the wax replica story.
Yes, so Steve pops out of his body in this hospital room in France. He feels totally great, no more pain. He touches his feet. He feels the cold linoleum floor beneath him. It feels completely solid to him, so he thinks he is fine. But then he turns around and looks at the hospital bed.
And he sees himself lying there.
He sees a person who looks exactly like him, pale and motionless. And his reaction is just so human and so stubbornly rational. He doesn't think, oh, wow, I am a spirit traversing the astral plane. He thinks, why did this French hospital make a wax replica of me?
That is actually so funny. It just shows how the human mind desperately tries to rationalize the impossible. He genuinely thought the doctors swapped him out for a dummy.
It really does. He is checking his depth of field. He is actively listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights. He is testing reality like a scientist, and his consciousness is fully operational, hyper-operational even, all while his physical body is just a flatlining lump on the bed.
Nicole Kerr had a highly verifiable vertical moment, too, with the paramedic, right?
Yes, the sternal knuckle press. She watched the paramedic work on her crushed body from above. She literally saw him digging his knuckles hard into her sternum, which is a standard technique used to elicit a pain response in unresponsive trauma patients. From her vantage point up in the air, she saw her own physical pupil flinch. She described the specific medical procedure in detail later, which perfectly confirmed she was observing the scene from an elevated outside vantage point.
So if we are tracking this, common ground point number one is very clear. The self is entirely distinct from the hardware. The brain is just the radio receiver, but the consciousness is the actual signal. And when the radio breaks, the signal doesn't die. It just stops playing through that specific speaker.
That is a fantastic analogy. But once you leave the room, you have to go somewhere. The signal has to travel. And this is where we get into the transition phase.
The famous tunnel of light that pop culture always talks about.
Sometimes, yes. But what is really fascinating in this specific stack of accounts is that for many of them, it actually starts with darkness. Not necessarily a terrifying, scary darkness, but a massive void. A place of deep waiting.
Howard Pittman describes it as a darkness so dark there are no human words for it. He felt totally isolated and abandoned at first.
Peter Panagore also saw an infinite darkness, but then he describes a tiny pinprick of light, and this is where the physics of their accounts get very weird. He says the light came rushing toward him.
Faster than the speed of light.
Right, and he describes the tunnel itself as being infinitely wide and yet small enough to intimately contain us simultaneously. We are getting into non-Euclidean geometry here. It strongly suggests that the dimension they are entering simply does not follow our earthly rules of space and time.
When they finally meet the source of that light, this is where it gets highly emotional. Because almost everyone in our stack, regardless of their prior background, describes a specific person or a presence waiting for them.
Let's look at Nancy Ryan's data again. Remember, she is the hardcore atheist scientist. She'd not believe in God, angels, none of it. She wakes up in this beautiful meadow, which she actually realized later was a constructed environment just for her comfort. And she meets a female entity. She never clearly sees the face, but she deeply understands her to be a teacher.
And what did that entity actually say to her?
She said, "This is your home."
Welcome home. We hear that exact phrase over and over in these reports.
Nancy says she was explicitly told, "You are part of me. You are part of us." And she realized in that exact moment that life on Earth was actually the illusion, the Shadowlands, so to speak. And this place she arrived in was the base reality.
Olden Lee, the teenager, had the exact same overwhelming feeling. He said the light wasn't just shining right above him, it was actively coming into him. He also called it home. He said it was a feeling of total bliss, like being wrapped in a heavy, warm blanket after being freezing cold.
And Brian Melvin, our militant atheist drug dealer, he heard music. But he makes a very specific point to say it wasn't just sound waves, it was pure information. He said he understood every single word perfectly, and the music was directly extolling God's character. He eventually lands on this solid rock suspended in deep space.
And who does he meet on the rock?
He meets Jesus. But, and this is a vital data point, he describes him with very specific, gritty historical details. He says the figure had a hood on, his beard looked rough like it had been plucked or torn, and he could clearly see the nail prints in the wrists.
Weight in the wrists, not the palms.
No, the wrists. Which, historically and anatomically speaking, is actually far more accurate for Roman crucifixion. The bones in the palms simply cannot support the weight of a human body. But Brian, being an atheist drug dealer in the late 20th century, likely had absolutely no idea about that obscure historical and anatomical detail at the time.
That is wild. So despite the different figures they encounter, a female guide, a warm light, a historically accurate Jesus, the emotional signature is identical across the board. It is welcome home. It is a profound sense of belonging that is infinitely stronger than anything experienced on Earth.
Peter Panagore really put it best. He said he thought to himself, "This is me. How did I ever think I was that tiny broken thing," meaning his physical body? He felt he was an orb of pure consciousness 10,000 times bigger than his earthly form.
So you arrive, you feel this massive unconditional love. You feel like you are finally home. You probably think, okay, I made it. But then you have to sit down and review the tape.
The life review.
And this isn't just watching a home movie of your life while eating popcorn in a theater.
No, not at all. This is the part of the process that seems to fundamentally change these people the most. It is essentially a quantum empathy machine. In our physical world, memory is entirely one-sided. I remember what I said to you, and I remember how I felt saying it. But in the life review, you experience the interaction directly from the other person's perspective.
Nancy Ryan's example of this is so deeply relatable because it's just so small. She wasn't a murderer or a dictator. She was just a regular teenager who was mean to her sister once.
Right. She is kneeling by this beautiful pond in the meadow, and the ripples in the water start showing vignettes of her life. She focuses in on this one specific moment where she was 17 years old and she made a really snarky, hurtful comment to her 14-year-old sister.
Standard sibling stuff. We have all done something exactly like that.
In our world, yes, we brush it off. But in the review, she didn't just remember saying the words. She physically and emotionally felt the visceral pain she caused her sister. She felt her sister's spirit crush in real time. She felt the deep, lingering insecurity that her casual comment triggered.
That is frankly terrifying. To be forced to feel the exact pain you inflicted on everyone you ever met.
Peter Panagore says he literally suffered the pain he gave away, times 10,000. It is a perfect closed-loop feedback system. You are essentially judging yourself because you are finally feeling the absolute full weight of your own actions without any filters.
Brian Melvin had a significantly rougher review because he was an active drug dealer.
He saw what they call the ripple effect. He saw the friends he casually sold drugs to who then went on to get deeply addicted. He saw them get into severe legal trouble. He felt the agony of their parents crying over them. He realized that even though he always thought of himself as just a nice guy who liked to party, he was actually an active agent of destruction in all of their lives.
It just completely destroys the ego, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You cannot justify it anymore when you feel the other side of it.
That is the crucial key. On Earth, we have endless excuses. Oh, I was tired, or they started it, or I was just doing my job. In the life review, there are 0 excuses allowed. There is only the raw, energetic truth of the interaction.
And this perfectly leads us to what I think is easily the most shocking story in our entire stack, Howard Pittman.
The pastor.
Right, because this guy devoted his entire life to doing good. He was a preacher, he was a dedicated cop. He took in, get this, 32 foster children over the years.
A literal pillar of the community. If anyone gets a gold star at the pearly gates, you would assume it is this guy.
So he gets to the gates, or at least the entryway, and he is fully expecting a ticker tape parade. The classic, well-done, good and faithful servant routine.
And instead, he gets a harsh rejection letter.
A complete verbal smackdown from the divine.
He is point blank told that his faith was actually dead and his earthly works were completely in vain. Why? Because he did them entirely for himself.
That is such a heavy, nuanced concept. Doing good, charitable things, but doing them for yourself.
It highlights the massive distinction between doing good and actually being good. The voice told him he was actively worshiping a false god his entire life, and that God was his self. He was doing the exhaustive foster care, the loud preaching, the noble police work, so that Howard Pittman would be universally admired, so that Howard Pittman would feel righteous and superior.
So the actual currency of the afterlife isn't just the physical action. It is the deep, hidden intent behind the action.
Exactly. And it connects perfectly back to the atheists in our group, like Steve Kang or Nancy Ryan. They realized during their reviews that their secular lives were totally driven by ego, by academic tenure, by the need to always be right. Howard Pittman realized his highly religious life was driven by the exact same mechanism. It was just ego wearing a more respectable religious hat.
So what does this all tell us? It means you fundamentally cannot trick the system. You cannot fake it.
You are completely transparent.
Okay, now we have to transition to the dark side of this data. Because not everyone went straight to the fluffy clouds in the middle. We really need to talk about the descent phase.
Yes, we do. There is a strong tendency in modern pop culture to heavily sanitize near-death experiences. Everyone just assumes you see grandma and float in a warm light. But our sources, specifically Howard, Brian, and Steve, describe something very different and very alarming.
Let's start with the deception aspect. Because honestly, that creeped me out the most out of everything we read. Howard Pittman, right before he meets the real God, hears a beautiful voice.
A very beautiful, deeply melodious, calming voice. And it whispers to him, stop. No more pain. Just don't breathe.
It sounds like pure comfort.
It sounds exactly like mercy. But Howard is sharp and he realizes, wait a second. I specifically asked God to extend my physical life. If I stop breathing right now, I die permanently. He realized in a flash it was a deliberate trick. It was a calculated deception from a negative entity to get him to essentially commit spiritual suicide, to just give up before he reached the truth.
And Brian Melvin encountered a very similar, highly elaborate trap.
This is the deer pudding story. It is legitimately chilling. He finds himself in this dark place that looks like an industrial pit lined with holding cells. He calls them cubes. And he sees a woman standing there who genuinely thinks she is in paradise.
She sees her grandmother, right? Or something that looks like her.
Right. She sees a comforting figure that looks exactly like her beloved grandmother, who even calls her by her childhood secret nickname, Dear Pudding. The grandmother figure smiles and says, "Don't you feel the love here? It's wonderful." And she actively invites the woman to step inside the scenery.
But it is totally fake.
It is a complete hologram. Brian describes it as a malicious trap provided by demons, or whatever you want to call these negative predatory entities. Once the woman steps fully inside the illusion, the scenery instantly dissolves. She desperately reaches for a cup of water, and it turns into dry sand in her mouth. The beautiful trees morph into grabbing tentacles. It was an anglerfish lure.
Why, though? Why go through the effort of the deception?
The strong implication, according to both Brian and Howard, is that there are actual entities in that realm that feed directly on human confusion and despair. It is not just a place of passive punishment, it is actively predatory.
Steve Kang experienced this darker realm as what he called the cesspool.
Steve's account is incredibly visceral and upsetting. He is initially taken by beings he assumes are just normal hospital staff. They lead him down a hospital hallway that slowly gets grayer and fuzzier, and suddenly the facade drops and he realizes he is standing in a dark void. He explicitly called it a foul cesspool.
And he immediately uses prison terminology to describe his status there. He said he was new fish.
He describes being physically and spiritually brutalized. Dark, shadowy figures attacking him, violating him. But he makes a profound point. He says the physical pain of the attacks wasn't even the worst part. The absolute worst part was the sheer emotional confusion of it. He kept thinking, why do they hate me so much? I don't even know them.
It is the absolute total absence of empathy.
Yes. If we define heaven or the light as a place of pure connection and radical empathy, like we saw in the Life Review, then hell is simply the total absence of it. It is pure, freezing isolation and unchecked predation.
And here is where it gets really interesting for our structural analysis. There's an escape button, and it seems to be the exact same button for everyone, regardless of theology.
True surrender.
Steve Kang was a staunch atheist. He literally did not know how to pray. He was trapped in this void, and he tried reciting the American Pledge of Allegiance and then the Gettysburg Address because he couldn't think of a single religious prayer to say.
Which the dark entities actively mocked, by the way. They laughed in his face as he recited it. But then in a moment of total, utter desperation, he just yells out into the void, "Jesus, please save me." He admits he didn't even intellectually believe it when he said it. It was just a blind, desperate Hail Mary.
And what happens?
He is instantly rescued. A brilliant light shatters the darkness, and massive arms just pull him straight out of the pit.
Brian Melvin reports the exact same mechanism. He was being physically dragged into his own personal holding cell, which bizarrely contained a rusty dentist's chair of all things. And he realized he couldn't fight these creatures anymore. His strength was gone. He just completely surrendered his ego. And he says Jesus immediately picked him up like a child and carried him out of the darkness.
The profound insight here from the data is that the rescue mechanism is not about having the correct theological membership card. It is not about being a registered Baptist or a devout Catholic. It is entirely about a pure cry for help from the deepest part of the heart. It is about total humility. The exact second the human ego fully breaks and says, "I cannot do this myself, please help me," the help immediately arrives.
It is almost like the universe is just patiently waiting for our permission to intervene.
That is exactly it. Free will is universally respected even in the depths of hell. You have to willingly ask to leave.
So after the rescue, or for those who luckily skip the dark parts entirely, they start to clearly see the layout of the land, the architecture of the afterlife.
Right, because this isn't just a chaotic, fluid dreamscape. It clearly seems to have rigid structure. Nancy Ryan talks extensively about a holding place. She realized the beautiful meadow she was in wasn't the final destination at all. It was just a temporary classroom created specifically for her comfort so her mind wouldn't shatter while she learned the new rules.
Like a decompression transition zone for the newly arrived.
Yes. And Howard Pittman talks about being taken on a tour of the second heaven, which he describes as a vast realm of principalities, essentially a complex hierarchy of working spirits. And while he is there, he drops a statistical data point that is, quite frankly, terrifying.
The 2.5% stat.
Yes. He claims that while he was observing from that vantage point, he watched 2,000 people physically die down on Earth in a roughly 15-minute window. And according to his direct observation, only 50 of them. 2.5%, actually made it to the third heaven or the gates of the true positive afterlife. The vast majority were stuck in the lower transition levels or trapped in the darkness.
That is a staggeringly low number. It really makes you wonder what the strict criteria actually are.
It does, and it strongly reinforces his earlier point about dead works and worshiping the false god of self. He is heavily suggesting that most people, even the highly religious ones, are operating purely out of hidden ego. And that heavy ego literally weighs them down energetically. It physically prevents them from rising to the higher frequencies.
Brian Melvin also clearly saw distinct levels during his tour. He saw varying degrees of what he called recompense.
He specifically mentions that not absolutely everyone in the dark place was being actively tortured by demons. Some were just profoundly bored, stuck in gray concrete cells, staring blankly at a wall, completely bored out of their minds.
A literal hell of endless boredom.
Imagine being locked in a tiny room with nothing but your own worst regrets playing on a loop for eternity. That is its own horrific form of psychological torment. But he also did see active, severe torment. He claims to have seen specific historical figures, people like Adolf Hitler and Reinhard Heydrich.
Well, we have to be clear, we are just reporting what he claimed to see.
Right.
But he said he saw Hitler in an oven, right?
That is exactly what he described in his account. He saw these architects of the Holocaust being placed continuously on the receiving end of their own historical atrocities. Again, it is the ultimate extreme version of the empathetic life review. You reap exactly what you sowed.
And then there's the massive influx of knowledge they report. Nicole Kerr talks about having literal 360-degree vision, seeing the past, the present, and the probable future all happening simultaneously.
Nancy Ryan saw what she described as a glowing compass rose map of her entire life. She saw that she could have easily taken many different branching paths based on her free will choices, but they all remarkably eventually led back to the exact same ultimate destination. It heavily suggests a complex mix of free will and fixed destiny. You freely choose the scenic route, but the final destination is already locked in.
So you have crossed over. You have seen the other side. You have felt the absolute unconditional love. You have seen the complex structure of the universe. And then you were abruptly told you have to go back to work on Earth.
And absolutely nobody wants to go back.
That is such a consistent pattern in these accounts.
Yeah.
Nancy Ryan fiercely argued with the entity. She literally tried to physically run around her teacher to stay in the meadow. And when she was forced back, she woke up in the hospital recovery room, violently screaming, "Where is she? I don't want to be here."
Peter Panagore regretted the choice to return the exact second he was back in his frozen body. He said the physical world looked completely flat and cartoonish compared to the hyper-reality he had just left. He actually said earthly sunrises looked ugly to him for a very long time because they were just pale, washed-out imitations of the true light he saw.
Steve Kang got into a full-blown argument with Jesus. He essentially said, "I absolutely do not want to go back to that cruel, violent world down there." And he got a very profound, direct answer back.
The answer was, what is in your heart is what you will find.
That is an absolute mic drop moment from the universe.
It truly is. Because it instantly shifted the entire responsibility back onto Steve's shoulders. If you constantly see cruelty in the world, it is because you are actively looking at it with cruel, cynical eyes. If you carry genuine love, you will naturally find love. It is essentially quantum mechanics applied directly to human psychology. The conscious observer deeply affects the reality they perceive.
And when they do finally come back, they are fundamentally changed. They have a completely new mental operating system.
Holden Lee came back with what sounds like a radical physiological change. He describes a constant, intense electrical flow moving through his physical body. He terms it a Kundalini awakening. He became hypersensitive to other people's emotional energy. He simply couldn't go back to his normal, mundane teenage life. He ended up moving out west and completely changing his entire life trajectory.
Nicole Kerr, on the other hand, actually suppressed the traumatic memory of leaving her body for 19 full years.
Which is a very common psychological trauma response. But when the memory finally flooded back to her during a random flashback at a Starbucks of all places, she immediately realized her life's singular mission was to help stop humanity's deep-seated fear of death.
And what about Brian Melvin, the hardcore militant atheist drug dealer?
He became a devout believer the second he opened his eyes. His very first words upon waking up in the hospital were a desperate prayer of deep gratitude. He went from actively mocking Christians to being one instantly. But not in the rigid, judgmental religious sense, in the profound experiential sense. He knew the truth because he saw it.
So we have unpacked the violent exit, the confusing transition, the profound empathetic review, the terrifying descent, the complex architecture, and the reluctant return. Let's try to synthesize all this data for you. What exactly is the ultimate common ground here?
If we rigorously analyze all 7 of these diverse sources, I think we can solidly identify 4 distinct pillars of reality that they all completely agree on.
Okay, lay them out. Point 1.
Point 1 is that consciousness is fundamentally non-local. You are absolutely not your brain. Every single one of them, from the atheist scientist to the teenage kid, confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that the self exists entirely independently of the biological hardware.
Which changes everything about how we view death. All right, point 2.
Point 2 is that the universe is inherently moral and energetic. It is not at all about a rigid list of archaic rules you memorized in Sunday school. It is entirely about the specific energy of your daily actions. The Life Review categorically proves that every single tiny action has a tangible, energetic weight that you will eventually have to carry and feel for yourself.
It's basically physics. It's Newton's third law applied directly to the human soul. Every action has an equal emotional reaction.
Exactly right. Now, point 3 is that love is the primary underlying fabric of the universe. Peter Panagore called it being burned completely clean by a purgative love. Nancy Ryan felt an overwhelming unconditional love from her guide. Steve Kang realized the only thing that actually matters in life is simply loving one another. Even in the deepest, darkest depth of the void, pure love was the only functional rescue rope.
And the final point, point 4.
Point 4 is the constant battle of deception versus truth. The self, or the earthly ego, is the ultimate enemy. It is the primary trap. Whether it is Howard Pittman doing amazing charity works just for public applause, or the woman in the deer pudding hell wanting a comfortable, familiar lie instead of reality, the only proven way out of the trap is radical humility and absolute truth.
That brings us to a really fascinating, provocative thought to end this deep dive on. Some of these sources heavily hint that what we are all doing right here, right now on Earth, isn't actually the real part of existence.
You are talking about the simulation theory aspect.
Yes. Holden Lee explicitly mentions in his account that this entire earthly realm might just be a complex simulation, specifically designed to build and test our consciousness, to slowly take us from a raw, beast-like state to a fully enlightened spiritual state.
And Nancy Ryan's spiritual teacher casually referred to human life on Earth as a near-life experience.
I just love that specific phrase so much.
It completely flips the script. It implies that real life, the full, high-definition, expansive reality, is actually over there on the other side.
Yeah.
And we are all just sitting here currently enrolled in a very low-resolution, muddy boot camp.
So if this life we're living right now is just the near-life experience, maybe we should all stop worrying so much about arranging the temporary furniture here and focus a lot more on exactly who we're sitting on it with.
I honestly couldn't have synthesized it any better myself.
So here's a final thought for you to take away. If you had to instantly feel the absolute emotional ripple effect of your last 24 hours from everyone else's perspective right now, would you actually enjoy the experience? That is definitely something heavy to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We will see you on the other side.
Hopefully not too soon, though.
Fair enough. See you next time.